Welcome to Global Buzz, where we discuss the latest global developments. In this video, we will explore the controversial and tragic story of white farmers in Zimbabwe, who are now facing serious consequences with the legacy of Mugabe's land grab without compensation. Zimbabwe, formerly known as Rhodesia, was once a British colony that was ruled by a white minority for nearly a century. During this time, white settlers seized most of the fertile land from the indigenous black population, who were relegated to marginal and overcrowded areas. This created a deep resentment and a violent struggle for independence, which was finally achieved in 1980 under the leadership of Robert Mugabe, a former guerrilla fighter and a hero of the Liberation War. Mugabe became the first prime minister of Zimbabwe, and later the president, and initially pursued a policy of reconciliation and cooperation with the white minority, who still owned about 70% of the agricultural land, despite being only 5% of the population. Mugabe also agreed to a constitutional clause that protected private property rights and limited land redistribution to a willing buyer, willing seller basis, with compensation paid by the British government. However, this arrangement soon proved to be inadequate and unsustainable, as the demand for land reform from the landless black majority grew stronger, and the funding and support from Britain dwindled. Mugabe also faced increasing political and economic challenges as his popularity declined due to corruption, mismanagement, and human rights abuses. He needed a way to rally his supporters and deflect the blame from his own failures. In 1997, Mugabe announced that he would seize 1,500 white-owned farms without compensation and redistribute them to landless black peasants and war veterans. This was a radical departure from the previous agreement and a violation of international law. It also sparked a diplomatic row with Britain, which refused to fund the land reform program and accused Mugabe of being a dictator and a tyrant. In 2000, Mugabe suffered a humiliating defeat in a referendum that would have given him more power and allowed him to confiscate more land. In response, he unleashed a wave of violence and intimidation and encouraged his loyalists to invade and occupy white-owned farms by force. This was the beginning of the so-called fast-track land reform program, which was neither fast nor orderly, but rather chaotic and destructive. Over the next few years, thousands of white farmers were evicted from their homes, often brutally and sometimes fatally. Their farms were taken over by Mugabe's cronies, who had no experience or interest in farming, and who neglected and looted the land and the equipment. The consequences of the land reform were devastating for Zimbabwe's economy and society. The agricultural sector, which was the backbone of the economy and the main source of foreign exchange, collapsed as the new settlers lacked the skills, inputs, and infrastructure to maintain the productivity of the farms. The country, once known as the breadbasket of Africa, became dependent on food aid and imports, as millions of people faced hunger and malnutrition. The loss of agricultural output also triggered a domino effect of hyperinflation, unemployment, poverty, and social unrest, as the economy contracted by 40% between 2000 and 2008. Millions of Zimbabweans fled the country, seeking refuge and opportunities elsewhere. The land reform also ruined Zimbabwe's relations with the West, which imposed sanctions and isolation on Mugabe's regime, accusing it of human rights violations and electoral fraud. Mugabe's land reform program was widely condemned by the international community and resulted in sanctions and isolation for Zimbabwe. It also failed to achieve its stated goals of social justice and economic empowerment. Instead, it created a new class of landless and impoverished Zimbabweans who were dependent on the government's patronage and handouts. It also destroyed the environment as deforestation, soil erosion, and wildlife poaching increased. The situation of the white farmers, who were once the privileged and powerful elite, became precarious and pitiful. They lost their livelihoods, their assets, and their rights. Philip Rankin, a farmer, had long hoped for compensation after his family farm in Zimbabwe was seized because he was white, but cancer caught up with him first. The 65-year-old farmer died in early December, nearly 7 years after he was handcuffed and forcibly removed from his farm by truckloads of police from Robert Mugabe's government. Like many of the thousands of white Zimbabwean farmers who have faced the same fate since Mugabe's farm invasions and takeovers began in early 2000, he found life difficult without the land his family had farmed for more than 30 years. Mr. Rankin found work for a few years, but then developed cancer. His widow, Anita, said, "I hoped he would be well enough for us to take him outside to see the sun one more time." But that didn't happen. She said it was now unclear how she would pay his medical costs. "We did a valuation on our farm and were hoping for compensation, but we will think about this after his funeral," she said. Many other old white farmers who lost their land are now destitute, relying on charity to survive. While the Zimbabwean government has agreed on paper to compensate them for their losses, they fear their chances of getting money are dwindling as the debt-ridden country has no money to pay them. They were also demonized and marginalized by the state media, which portrayed them as enemies of the nation and agents of imperialism. Some of them left the country, seeking refuge in neighboring South Africa or other countries, while others stayed and tried to adapt to the new reality. Many of them faced trauma, loss, and bitterness as they witnessed the destruction of their farms and the deterioration of the country they loved. Some of them also faced legal battles as they challenged the legality and constitutionality of the land seizures in the courts, both in Zimbabwe and internationally. In 2017, Mugabe was ousted from power by a military coup after 37 years of rule. His successor, Emmerson Mnangagwa, promised to revive the economy and restore the rule of law. He also pledged to compensate the white farmers for their losses and to return some of their land, especially those who were protected by bilateral investment treaties. However, these promises have been met with skepticism and suspicion as the government lacks the funds and the political will to implement them. Many white farmers are still waiting for justice and closure, while others have moved on and accepted their fate. The story of white farmers in Zimbabwe is a tragic and complex one that reflects the history and the challenges of the country. It is a story of colonialism and liberation, of racism and reconciliation, of greed and violence, of hope and despair. It is a story that has no simple or easy answers, but rather raises many questions and dilemmas. It is a story that is still unfolding, and that has implications for the future of Zimbabwe and Africa.
For more news like this across the globe, please subscribe to our channel, like and share this video. Thank you.